It's been a year since hundreds of thousands of French citizens protested against a hike on fuel prices. What became known as the Yellow Vest movement against social inequality posed a challenge to President Emmanuel Macron. But what's changed since then? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. When hundreds of thousands of people dressed in fluorescent, sleeveless jackets protested in France last November, not many people realized how powerful a movement it would become. Paris became the center of this growing anger. There were scenes of destruction and chaos across the French capital. It was all sparked by attacks on fuel. But it quickly turned into a weekend of running battles with French police. The protesters' demands grew to include President Emmanuel Macron's resignation. He refused to step down, saying he was the right man to fix France's problems. That includes addressing low wages, higher living standards, and economic inequality. Although Macron says he's taken measures, a year on, the protesters say he has not done enough. We'll bring in our guest shortly, but first, Natasha Butler reports from Paris.
Well, the Yellow Vest movement began 1 year ago. It began as a protest over high fuel prices, but it soon turned into something so much bigger, a grassroots social movement over the cost of living and against a French president and government that many people in France said was simply out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people. Now, where the Yellow Vest movement has really succeeded over the last year is it's inspired many supporters and followers, not just in France, but in other countries around the world. It's also really thrown a spotlight on a whole segment of French society, people who work, who have jobs, but still struggle financially. And it forced the French President, Emmanuel Macron, to change his approach and try and do more for working people who say that they are actually poor. One of the problems, though, is this Yellow Vest movement seems to have lost momentum over the past months because there are less people joining the weekly street protests.
I'm scared for the movement's future because we have failed to be united. If everyone was in the street, all this would have been over a long time ago. We would have been heard.
The movement can take on a different shape now. What's important is that we raised awareness, gave people a voice and took risks.
What the protesters want now is to try and revive the cause, but it won't be easy because many people in France, even though they support the cause, opinion polls suggest that most French people don't want a return to the street demonstrations. So if the Yellow Vest movement isn't to be a street protest movement, well, what is it to become? That's the big question. And what many people say is what it needs to become is some sort of political force or united organisation. So far, though, it has failed to do that. I'm Natasha Butler in Paris for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guest. Alexander Chantry is coordinator of the Yellow Vest movement in Lille and joins us from Lille by Skype. Philippe Marlière is professor of French and European politics at the University College London. He joins us from London. Rémi Bourgeois is an economist and associate fellow at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs and joins us from Paris. Welcome to all of you. Alexander, is the Yellow Vest movement staging a comeback?
Yes, this weekend we have a lot of people in the streets, and the movement of the Yellow Vest built really a big struggle in France for 1 year. So this weekend we have a comeback here.
Philip, do you think that the movement has the potential to continue building up the momentum it used to have in the past?
Well, we shall see. It's a very hard question, but I think who would have guessed or known that a year on, the Yellow Vests would still take to the streets as they did on Saturday, yesterday, for the 1 year, of street protest, weekly street protest. It started off with occupying roundabouts in the sort of outskirts of big cities in sort of semi-urban, semi-rural areas. And they're still on, they're still there 1 year after. So Yes, I think it's clearly could still be there for a while. I think the protest now is in a sense bigger than actually taking to the streets, being there. You know, people wearing yellow vests. It's a sign of political protest. You know, which is I think deeper and wider than that.
Remy, we're not seeing the same large crowds we used to see in the past. For you, do you believe that the spirit of the rebellion is still there?
Well, the movement has always been very decentralized, and the main issue has been when some violent groups took over what actually was the core of the movement in the first place. So there's really a complex dynamic in this movement, but still the social malaise is still very present and very ingrained in French society. So whatever the shape the movement really takes or follows in coming months and years, this malaise is still there, and it's very likely to persist for deep economic reasons and an aggravation of difficulties related to living standards, and the housing bubble is a key element of that. But of course, there's an array of issues that are still very much influencing the political debate. And the key thing in this movement is that trade unions have been really on the sidelines because they didn't really address those concerns, and they're more concerned about particular interests. And at the same time, political parties, most of them, has somehow collapsed on the French political stage. So there's really a lack of representativity of existing political groups and trade unions, and that's why you see that kind of movement, and it's likely to persist in terms of the malaise in French society.
Alexander, when you look back into what you have been going through for almost a year, what do you think was the biggest achievement of the Yellow Vest, and what was the biggest failure?
I think the movement of Yellow Vest didn't get any satisfactory answers for the government, but we have recreated the band solidarity and fraternity in France. After years of politics of fear, we have also managed to make the link between the different struggles, and especially today we have become the majority struggle movement in France. Our responsibility today is therefore to bring about convergence, and to arrive at a global movement. The prospect of December 5 is very encouraging, and we will fully participate. And now we create a really global movement.
Philip, when you have a movement like Yellow Vest, which took the political establishment by surprise, however, it does not have a leadership structure, do you think that this is one of the key weaknesses of the movement?
Possibly. I think it's probably a sign of strength as well as a sign of weakness, as you put it, because a sign of strength, in a sense, it's a very new type of movement. We've never seen that before. It's a relatively mass movement, although let's not overdo that. Yesterday, across France, I think it was about no more than 30,000 people taking to the streets, which is relatively, it's not a big number and far less than a year ago. But it's not the numbers which matter here. It's essentially, you know, the fact that it's another way also of doing politics. So the fact that it is a leaderless movement is a sign of democratic health, if you like. It's also a sign of weakness in a sense that, of course, when you think about in terms of political outcomes, it's much more difficult to formulate, you know, political policy inputs and be heard by any political power, if yourself, you know, you're not led by, you know, any group or any type of leader. And I think that's probably the current problem of the Yellow Vest at the moment.
Remy, when you've been talking earlier about the ongoing economic pressure in France, but when you look at the job creations, which have been climbing over the last few months, unemployment, which has been declining at the same time, couldn't this be one of the reasons why the general sentiment among the people in France is no longer supportive of the Yellow Vest movement?
Well, I don't really think so. It's true there's been this improvement in headline figures in terms of employment, but employment conditions remain really poor, and especially for a whole part of French society really stuck in short-term contracts. And by short-term contracts, I mean contractors for a few weeks, really extremely precarious situations. So employment conditions remain really poor for a whole part of French society, and in the context of rising housing prices, all this housing crisis taking place, there's really an amount of economic pressure that is really severe on many people in this country and across the globe, that's related to all kind of macroeconomic factors and monetary issues. So things for people really concerned have not really improved, and headline employment figures are very, very general, very aggregate numbers. And if you look behind that at really the economic reality facing many people, and it's not only the uneducated, it's broader than that. Also younger people in this country and many countries across the globe and in Europe. And we have to be aware, of course, the impact of the global financial crisis and the euro crisis in Europe, and the policies that have been put in place. And these have had really lasting effects on people, on working conditions, on the access to the job market, and to housing. So behind those really headline figures, there's really an array of much more precise issues facing many people.
Alexander, Yellow Vest movement was always saying that it wants to take things into its own hands. You've been acting basically on your own for many, many months. Do you think it is about time for you to reach out to different key players, like, for example, the trade unions, to be able to set up stronger, wider, bigger rallies across the nation?
Yeah, I think we need make the link between the trade unions movement, because now we have a lot of problem in France. Poverty, we have a lot unemployment settles, and now we need to build really movement, social movement in France with the trade union, with the association. Today, the President Macron not hear our angry, and now we need build a really good movement. I'm sorry for English.
No worries. Philip, don't you think that Macron, in a way or another, managed over the months to take out the steam out of the discontent movement by starting those measures, particularly when it comes to the alleviating the case for the poor people in France?
Well, he's done it to some extent, not, of course, too late and too little for people who protest against his policies, of course. That's why the protest is still on a year after it started. But I think why we can say that it wasn't on the script, it wasn't on Macron's script to have, so early in his presidency, so many people taking to the street and protesting. Of course, initially it seemed to be quite anecdotic, with protest against the tax on fuel, and also it was about speed limit. I think he stayed put on speed limit, but he conceded very much by scrapping the tax on fuel. But then it became something wider and more political, and I think it's about pay, it's about the state of public services, about employment, it's about inequalities. So, of course, what the Yellow Vests have done is to lay bare probably the nature of the economic project of Macron. Macron was elected with a reputation of being a rather centrist figure, and it seems that now the Yellow Vests seem really to disagree with that. They say, well, essentially his policies, the economic policies, have been at the service of the rich and not to our benefit. So I think clearly he's had probably to pause and reflect upon that. I'm not saying the yellow vests have made him completely change tact, but I think at least he's slowed down and had to take into account a number of their claims.
Remy, has the movement in a way or another changed President Macron, because he was keen on continuing his liberalizing reforms to fix the decades-long problems of the French economy, and to a certain point he is saying, you know what, I have to give it a second thought because of what's going on the streets?
Well, the government has tried to alleviate some of the concerns that really were voiced by in the protests. But generally, since 2017, the government has been mostly concerned with avoiding major strikes, with avoiding to antagonize trade unions too much, without really taking into account these really grassroots movements that would really come to the fore, like the Yellow Vest movements. And after the Yellow Vest movement started, they announced a set of measures in terms of social spending. So that was significant in a way, but certainly not really enough if you take into account the whole set of demands and all the unease that was expressed in those demonstrations. That really go much beyond the initial demands in terms of fuel costs and things like that. So there's still really this imbalance in French and European politics.
Alexander, do you still think that President Macron must resign, must go?
Personally, I find that the president listens and does not hear me and the Yellow Vest. People are angry. The report is quite simple, in fact. A minority of the population, the oligarchy, pull the string all the world wealth and therefore of our country. Disparities are growing, and especially there is a violent liberal and anti-social policy that we denounce. Poverty explodes and mass unemployment settles definitively. Austerity policies will not bring us out to the torpor of we are in. So Macron is a capitalist, and we need a really social policy in France.
Philip, how concerned should Macron be with this perception that has been now relayed by Alexander, that Macron is widely seen by many people as someone who is disconnected from reality, not the man of the people, being closer to the rich elite?
I think he should be pretty concerned indeed, because, and I think also he's come to really accept that ought to be taken seriously, at least probably his advisors told him so. For instance, he launched a 2-month national debate to try really to appease the tension which was rising across the country. But of course, these are cosmetic things, it doesn't really address the deep down the malaise in society. So on the one hand, it is fair to say that Macron is seen as an out-of-touch president really working in the interest of the richer segments of the population as opposed to the sort of lower middle classes and the poor. That is probably a fact. His also personality doesn't always go down well with the public, a bit arrogant, a bit that's all this sort of thing. But that should he resign right now as a Yellow Vest, you might think so, but he's got no reason to resign now. Why? Because his strength is exactly, it lies in the weakness of all his major political opponents, which are nowhere to be seen, starting with the left. The left hasn't benefited from the movement, and the right, the sort of mainstream right, neither. I think the only other major party which is doing well is the far right, the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen. So Macron knows that, and he's certainly thinking, if I have again to have a rerun of the 2017 second round against Le Pen, I will win again. So I think he's got no reason to resign because his opponents are politically very weak.
Remy, from a purely economic perspective, what do you think Macron should do next to be able to answer some of the concerns voiced by the Yellow Vest movement?
Well, there's really there are deep imbalances really facing the French economy, especially against a European background. And there was all this focus from the start of his presidency on European reforms to further European integration, especially within the Eurozone. But there's been extremely little talk of rebalancing, especially among European countries, between France and Germany. Most of the debate has been about grandiose plans for systematic reforms, banking union, fiscal transfers, and things like that. But it hasn't happened in any way because of German opposition to that mostly. But then there has been no real debate about economic rebalancing. Now, European governments are somehow asking the German government to spend more to restart growth in Europe. It comes very late, and that's a very narrow debate. There should be a much broader and deeper debate about real economic rebalancing, how to bring back economic activity to those relegated regions where the Yellow Vest movement has really started in a sense. Of course, what has been really most striking was in the city centres, but it's really been a country-wide protest, especially in those relegated areas. So from an economic perspective, it's really how about to make all these areas competitive again. And it's not just about lowering labour costs and things like that. It's also about innovation coordination to find a more balanced economic path.
Alexander, what's next for you, for the Yellow Vest movement? What's your plan for the future, the near future?
For the future, I think the movement today has a really responsibility in social struggle in France. That of forging, we need founding relation between the trade unions, the association. We must combine. Then, politically, is necessary to take against the end and to even invent the local election. That's why we have created our political movement in Lille. Our ambition is to give back the keys to the people, and we need to keep the streets to in front from Emmanuel Macron, because politics is not good for the poor people, for every people in France. You have politics just for a few percentage of France. I'm sorry for my English.
No worries. Philip, Emmanuel Macron is keen on seeing his controversial pension reform pass through the parliament. Could this be another magnet that would rally many people, including the Yellow Vest movement, against him?
Probably, because I think the first signs are not good for Macron. I think this is a highly controversial measure which tends really to sort of uniformize different pension schemes. But of course, when you do that, you will sort of undo or change pension schemes, and people will get unhappy about that, and in some cases rightly so. So I think the first sign, probably that's an effect of the Yellow Vest, is that when a month ago he sort of started talking about his big pension scheme and reform, I think he said first we ought to have a month-long national debate. So that's probably a sign, you know, it's a yellow vest effect, that before he would probably try to bulldoze literally the scene and just do it. Now he consults. Of course, that might not be absolutely real consultation, but at least he's being careful. Yes, he has to tread with that extremely carefully.
Extraordinary times ahead for the French society. Indeed. Philippe Barlière, Alexander Chantry, Rémy Bourgeot, thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al-Barra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.